to everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vishwas Satka. I chair the board of the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. We've been coordinating the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign response to COVID-19. It's in that context we've been convening the National Food Crisis Forum. We've now had over 12 meetings in the course of this year of this forum. We've been working on various fronts, from sort of food relief mapping and support work, and getting more profile and recognition for some of those initiatives, supporting food sovereignty pathway building work, campaigning for a basic income grant, and also challenging some of the food price hikes that we've seen and so on. We've constantly called for the democratization of the disaster management stroke COVID-19 response of government, and that demand remains from our side. This being the last forum for the year, we felt it was very, very important to grapple with two issues. We've always invited, if you like, leading activists or academics or experts to talk to us on specific issues. So we want to close the year with an input by Bellay from the South African Food Sovereignty Alliance. And Million's been central in the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, and they put out a very powerful critique of the Green Revolution on the continent. And they show pitfalls, failures, etc. in the research that has been done. So Million's going to kind of speak to that issue. We also have Professor Ruth Hall from PLAAS at the University of Western Cape. We've invited Prof. Hall to speak to us about government's push to distribute farms and farming land and so on, and to really help us understand what does this mean in terms of redistribution, in terms of agrarian transformation, and ultimately building a new food system. So both these guests will help us grapple with this challenge of the next food system, which has been a debate that we've been leading around food sovereignty, agroecology, and so on, as part of the deep just transition. So that's going to occupy the first part of our meeting today. We will then transition into sort of reports from some of the working areas of this forum. The one report has to do with our popular education program around food sovereignty. We've been getting very good subscriptions to those online training sessions, and people are setting up their gardens. They are setting up food sovereignty initiatives in communities, etc. So we'll get some reporting on that. We've also been testing the disaster management system. We've been having a debate about whether we should trigger the UN food aid system to support the crisis or help us deal with the crisis in the country. But it's still a debate in our ranks. But in the meantime, we've been engaging the disaster management system. It meant to have an infrastructure across the country, localized offices. And so some of that kind of engagement will come through in today's meeting. And then lastly, we've been working with about 120 water-stressed communities. There have been some serious breakthroughs, particularly in the Eastern Cape, where the drought is continuing. So we'll hear about that work. And we've also been doing some work on a universal basic income grant. The government has chosen an austerity approach to macroeconomic policy and has pulled back some of the COVID relief grants that it put into place, although extending the COVID grant. But we've been busy with work to try and get the technical stuff done around a common civil society approach to universal basic income. So yeah, with that, over to you, Million, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Vishwas. Hugely appreciated. I really admire your work in South Africa, and we are learning a lot from what you are doing for our work in the rest of Africa. Thanks so much for contributing also to our work through your WhatsApp and other communications. I'm just putting my slide. Okay, my name is Bellay, as I said, and I'm the general coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. It's the biggest social movement or civil society movement in Africa. We work in 50 of the 55 African countries. Sorry. Yep. Okay. Yes. Is it fine now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Okay.
Continue.
Sorry. Yep. So, oh my God. So I'm going to talk about the Green Revolution versus the past agroecology. In general, the characteristics of the Green Revolution are adoption of, sorry, it's not adoption, adoption of new and improved varieties, application of new agricultural techniques, irrigation, mechanization, use of agrochemicals, focus on few and market value crops. If you are familiar with some of the projects in Agra countries, in other African countries, I'm sure you know this framework. So the Green Revolution has happened in the 1960s for wheat in Mexico, in other countries, and for rice in Thailand, Vietnam, Korea, Indonesia, and both for wheat and rice in India, China, and Pakistan. Wheat, Mexico, Egypt, and Turkey. So, the famous Malthusian theory and diagram, population grows geometrically and food production grows arithmetically. So, famine is inevitable at this point. So, the recommendation from Malthus was slowing the growth of population was the only possibility to prevent starvation. But it was claimed by the Green Revolution actors that actually we can beat the theory of Malthus and we can increase food production, and the increase in food production will be much higher than the increase in population. So we are fine. But in those countries who practiced the Green Revolution, especially in India, there were a lot of drawbacks. It favored farmers who could afford high yield varieties and agrochemicals, machines, and irrigation facilities. It indebted farmers, and they lost their properties and many of them migrated to cities. And new monocrops faced resistance to pests and weeds. It resulted in untold ecological disaster. It oriented to cash crops and not food for domestic consumption, and resulted in nutrition and health crisis. And as we all know, also,
Milian,
yes.
Sorry, we're still stuck on your first slide.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so maybe you can stop sharing and then share again, and
I'm
it just
sorry.
seems a bit stuck. Sure.
Okay.
Okay, now we can see the correct slide.
So is it fine now?
Yes, that's great.
It's on the Green Revolution drawbacks, yeah?
Yes.
So as I said, I'm not going to repeat what I said. The Green Revolution, these are the drawbacks of the Green Revolution. So it has resulted in a social, ecological, and economic crisis, even though in the beginning of the 60s, it has increased both wheat and maize production. Do you see the next slide now?
Yes, it's working.
Yes.
Yeah. So the war that we are having in food sovereignty movement is with narratives. And the narratives of the Green Revolution use statistics and diagrams and graphs very, very successfully. So one of these diagrams is this one. It shows food growing in Asia because of the Green Revolution, in South America, and projecting food growth decline in Africa. So the medicine to that is basically Green Revolution, and that medicine is couched in a bigger narrative for Green Revolution. And these are some of the narratives that's leading Green Revolution in Agra kinds of initiatives in Africa. The first is a priority to business to produce more food to feed Africa. You know that we are changing our laws and seed regulations. We are improving our infrastructure, and we are improving business investment laws, and basically to favor business. And this PPT is now a new mantra, as you know. And the narrative is that farmer seed is a problem. We need high yield varieties, and this high yield variety should be patented. Otherwise, we cannot feed Africa. And Africa's problem is mainly caused as a problem of calories. If you have more calories, then we have no solution, no problem. And land should be given to those who can make it productive. And that's what is, initiating land grabs in so many African countries. And indigenous knowledge is neglected, and only knowledge that is preserved is knowledge that comes from the universities. Knowledge comes from science. And most of the policies are produced at capital cities, both in our capitals, also in the northern. So, and the narrative is possible to produce one fits all solutions. So these are the narratives. An example of this narrative is a diagram that we got from Syngenta. It puts, as a lower level, small subsistence, small orders, agronomy, soil monitor management, OPVs, open pollinated varieties, and Mario. Basically, what we are calling now for agroecology is considered as backward, and we have to transition. We have to migrate out of agriculture. That's what this is saying. And advanced farmers are those farmers who use multi-trait hybrid seeds, gene traits, insect resistance, integrated solutions, post-harvest storage. So agroecology is considered as backward, and people have to move. The poor has to move out of agriculture, and advanced farmers are farmers who are going to do this. So this has actually, the stage of progression. So this has actually prompted what we call the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. It was founded in 2006 with a funding of 1 billion. I think this data is based on the research done by a number of Africa and German-based organizations, and that data is mainly collected by Team Wise. So this is based on the report. So the Aggro was funded by 1 billion, and 2/3 of the funding came from the Gates Foundation, and 524 million was grants. And the goal was by 2020 to double productivity, double income, half food insecurity for 30 million African small farmers. But it was supported heavily by African governments. They are spending 1 billion per year in subsidies for seeds and fertilizers. These are the countries, and this shows the amount of money each of the countries are getting. Well, what is the result of Aggro after more than 10 years? There is no evidence of 100% increase in productivity as they claimed. They favored crop, maize, only up by 29%, overall staple yields only by 18%. Subsidies expanding land planted to favored crops, not yields. No evidence of income doubling. Poverty is still high. And this one is quite shocking. No evidence of improved food security. 31% increase in number of undernourished people in Agra countries. Only 4 Agra countries showed a decline. In 9, it increased. I mean, Ethiopia is considered as one of the success countries, and I'm not sure about that. And resulted in erosion of local varieties of seed and the culture related to them. This is one typical example, one detrimental impact of Agra's work is declining in importance of traditional nutritional crops. Cassava 6% decline, root tubers 7% decline, sorghum 3%, only 3% yield growth, and groundnut 23% decline. So the verdict around Agra is Agra has not accomplished what it promised, despite they are spending a lot of funding and creating a host of social and environmental problems. So what we did in Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa is we wanted to explore whether there is another possibility, which is called agroecology. So what we did was we put, I know in 2013, does agroecology work in Africa? So we started to work to make an evidence-based and coherent case for agroecology as a sustainable long-term solution for farming in Africa. So we collected cases from so many African countries. You can find those cases on this website, on AFSA's website. And the cases were on agroecology, on land and soil, on pastoralism, on seed sovereignty. And you can get the cases. And we published those cases both on hard form, and also electronically. You can find them on our website. So just quickly, 3 of those cases. One is African leafy vegetable enterprise boosts livelihood of rural communities in Africa. This is a typical case of a consumer demand initiating or supporting production at the farmer's level or at the household level. There was a shortage of these leafy vegetables, and supermarkets start to have it, and consumers got used to it, and because of that, farmers produced. Even some schools have demanded African leaf vegetables for their students. So this is an example of a consumer driving agroecological production. This is a typical way of just changing management at the farm level and increasing your productivity. This was copied from the system of rice intensification. This is system of crop intensification in Ethiopia. Productivity has increased 3 folds, just by changing the management without using chemicals. This is a higher or landscape level work, mainly soil and water conservation, planting of green materials, trees and grasses, and also composting. Just because of these initiatives, that this landscape was rehabilitated, and this shows an experiment done in the last 20 or more years on 5 of critical crops in Africa, in Africa, yeah, but in Ethiopia in particular: barley, durum wheat, maize, teff, and faba bean. So the experiment was 1 farm without any chemical or compost input, another one with compost, and another one with chemical fertilizers. I think for the first years, 2-3 years, the productivity of the the farms which used chemical fertilizer was so high, but later on, compost could catch up, and productivity has sustainably increased, as you can see, over these 5 critical crops. So we did, this 80 or more case studies. We did a meta-level analysis of what the key findings. It increases yields. Agroecology increases yields and productivity. So you can tick one important outcome of any agricultural practices. Substantial income increases was witnessed in so many of the case studies. Improved soil fertility is a case for almost all of them. Food culturally appropriate. Cultural appropriateness of food is one of the pillars of food sovereignty and agroecology, and it's very much important. So foods are culturally appropriate. Increased crop diversity, a low risk of disease, increase in resilience. This is very, very critical. And food production and distribution under the control of farmers. So these are all the parts of the food system. Where I want to go to spend 1 or 2 minutes is on this slide. I hope I'm not over talking. What prevents change? You know, that I was asked to talk about what is preventing food sovereignty and agroecology to succeed. This is a research which has come out of the International Panel of Experts on the Sustainability of Food. So we have identified 8 lock-ins. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I will talk to some of them which are very much critical for our context. Past dependency. This is very, very critical. You know, once, you know, we know from experience that once farmers have started to use agrochemicals, started to be dependent on high input varieties, and also started to some farming techniques, it's very, very difficult to get back to agroecological farming. This will be the huge challenge to go back to agroecological kind of farming. And the measures of success, you know, how do we measure success? If we measure success by the productivity of only one crop, for example, maize on a farm or whatever, then probably you can compare maize one farm, the other farm, and you can say that, oh, green revolution is succeeding. But if you include all of the crops that are growing, I mean, in our system, in most of the system that I know, people intercrop when they plant. So there are other crops, you know. So if you measure the intercropped crops, also the nutritional content of the food, the health impact of the food, the environmental impact of the food, the cultural impact of the food, the human rights issues, then your measure of success would fail. So this is a very critical criteria. Short-term thinking, both from the government, you know, they have a very short cycling. They want to report that, you know, they have increased productivity by this percent or that percent. They have fed this number of people or whatever. And farmers also, you know, they have to survive. You cannot wait for 3 years for the land to change, for the soil to improve, to implement agroecology. It's very difficult for them. So short-term thinking is, you know, very, very critical factor in preventing for food sovereignty and agroecology success. And finally, feed the world narrative. This narrative is based on the Norman Bullock kind of narrative, you know, the productivity increasing in whatever. It's a very, very entrenched view in so many of the people that I spoke to in Africa. It's very difficult. They say that we cannot feed ourselves and the world without using agrochemicals, high yield varieties, and other techniques. So this is feed the world narrative. I finish now. Thank you very much. If you have question, I think I'll go back to your question later. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Million. Maybe we'll take some discussion on your input, and then we'll move to Ruth. So, colleagues and comrades, are there any comments? I know Ruth mentioned that this is not just about subsidies, it's also about seeds and other inputs. So this relates to the question of who really benefits from Agra, Million, and who's been getting the kind of resourcing in this process. Maybe you want to start with that issue.
I think there are people who are benefiting, and the people who are benefiting are mainly consultants, you know, and those who are working in key governmental offices. I mean, at the people level, might be maybe when you start using chemicals and high input varieties, for some years there will be an increase in productivity. obviously. And farmers get used to that. But what I heard from farmers over and over and over again is after some years, the soil will be dead to a point where you cannot grow anything without the application of fertilizers. But year in year out, experts do come from outside, and our the how the agricultural researchers think. Because of that entrenchment in the system, where the money is coming from, and what the narrative is, it's very difficult to move out of this kind of thinking. Otherwise, on ground you see a lot of failure, and that's what the story tells us. Maybe some farmers who have a large land, who are near water, who can irrigate their farm, who can easily access these high yield varieties, and who can easily get credits for some year, they can benefit. Yeah, but for the majority of smallholder farmers, it's being indebted and going into a path, a direction.
Yeah. Colleagues, I'm opening it up. I mean, is there anyone else who wants to ask a question or say something on the chat line? I see Ruth has said something here. We wrote a critique of narratives of scarcity and the politics of food crisis idea, how this underpins land grabbing. Ruth, please share that with us as well. We'll pass it on to activists. Courtney, Awande, Louise Schultz, Jane, anybody has any comments or questions? So Million, in the context of climate, how has Agra kind of responded to the climate crisis impacting?
I wrote a piece sometime, and we have in Agra the poster child of Agra in Ethiopia called the Agricultural Transformation Agency, ATA. So I wrote a critique of this organization, and I was invited to their office to talk to them.
Yeah.
And they say that, we are addressing climate change. How? By decreasing the amount of the usage of nitrogen. But it's also true that they are. It's also true that they are actually, because of the increasing criticism, they are focusing also on some techniques. But that's a piece of their work. You see, as we know, increasing diversity is so critical for adaptation to climate change, and the health of the soil is very critical for adaptation, and social cohesion is critical for adaptation to any kind of crisis. And also you have to think of the unexpectedness of the future. There is no unexpectedness in Agra's approach. They think that everything would be coming as planned. But as we know, there are social upheavals, environmental upheavals, including climate change. We don't know what's happening tomorrow. So for this kind of situations, I think it's difficult to rely on Agra kind of methodology.
Hi. Are you done, Million? Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Oh no, my reception is really bad here.
Bish, I can hear you.
Yeah.
I think we just can't
Yeah.
hear. We couldn't hear Million at the end.
Oh yeah, Million,
Yeah.
we couldn't hear you at the end there.
Oh, no, I'm just listening. What I'm saying is agroecology is much better for climate change. One, it enriches the soil. Soil is very critical part of the work. Second, it's based on diversity. Diversity is very critical for climate change, because if one crop fails, there will be another crop that you are relying on, short maturing, long maturing. We have over 100 varieties of wheat in Ethiopia, over 60 varieties of sorghum, over 60 varieties of teff. The diversity is astounding. Over 100 varieties of insects, the critical plants. Why did farmers innovate in all of this? Why is that? Because they need them for changing situation. And the social and environmental change has exacerbated now because of climate change and a host of other matters. So you need diversity as a base for your agriculture. But Agra kind of agriculture destroys this diversity, destroys the capacity of farmers also. Farmers' knowledge is very, very critical. It's part of the diversity in seeds, the diversity in plants. I can look at 100 varieties of wheat and I don't know. So their knowledge is very, very much critical, and how these seeds are managed also is very much important, and you get the knowledge from them. But the Green Revolution disregards the knowledge of farmers and comes with new techniques. That's what makes this past dependency in Agra a very, very detrimental effect for African farmers.
One last question, unless anyone else wants to ask. I keep on encouraging this group, but so part of rupturing this part dependency has got to do with how far we have gone with advancing the food sovereignty and agroecology alternative. And the evidence you've provided provides a critique. It's compelling. But where is the battle lines and where is the struggle right now on the continent? Are we winning or are we losing? Can you give us a perspective?
I think my perspective is slowly but surely we are winning. One, a lot of evidence is coming now that agroecology works. A lot of research is coming out, and we're doing our own research also. That's one. And second, unfortunately, our continent responds to international change in policy and in thinking rather than the thinking from the inside. So the international thinking around the food system is changing quite rapidly, and also prompted by the COVID situation. Not as rapid as we all wanted, but it's changing. Even with all its drawbacks, the Green New Deal from the US, the Green New Deal from the EU is an indication, it's a direction. It needs to improve quite in a big way, but it's an indication. And there are a lot of bigger groups organizing food system conferences. There's Eat Stockholm, there's the Barilla Foundation, there's the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, and we have organized our food system conference. So these big conferences are changing the narrative. So the narrative is being attacked, you see. And also we are being very, very much successful in Africa, and we publish and we campaign, and we use different avenues, and we are using soil, climate, as you know very well, food system, and also the entrepreneurship side of it. So slowly but surely things are changing, and Agra is feeling attacked now, which is very good, you see.
Thank you, Million. Thank you so much for this. I'm going to transition to Ruth now. And please note, we're recording this. It'll be shared with lots and lots of activists and so on. So Ruth, over to you, and we'll continue this theme. It'll pull through. Ruth?
Ruth, you're still on mute.
Oh,
there we go.
Thanks so much, Vishwas and Jane, and hi, Million, and hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. I'm sort of tempted to launch into discussions around food, but I was asked to talk about a particular initiative in South Africa, the recent announcement by Minister Toko Didiza, Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, who announced on the 1st of October an initiative to make available or release 700,000 hectares of state land for redistribution. Now, this comes, of course, against the backdrop of a long-standing failure to enact land reform at significant scale in South Africa, a long-standing unfulfilled promise of the democratic period. So one of the things that has been debated is, well, what is the significance of state-owned land versus privately owned land? And I think that for many people in South Africa, the first question is, well, where is this land? Because most state land is either protected areas or held by parastatals, or indeed sitting in the communal areas, the former Bantustans that were created by the apartheid state. So I wanted to share something about that, but use it as a basis for some discussion around what is an alternative framing of land reform, and what are the kinds of ways in which land reform can also start to support alternative food futures. So those are the discussions that I wanted to have. But let me start by just giving a bit of a sense of this debate about the significance of the state releasing its own land for land reform. So one of the first things that we thought was important to look at was, well, where is this land? And what's striking is that the state was proposing this split. 700,000 hectares is about half of 1% of South Africa. And what's very striking is that it's very unevenly distributed around the country. Nearly half of it, 300,000 hectares, being in just one province, the Northwest. And very strikingly, absolutely no land being made available either in Gauteng or in the Western Cape. It's already for us, this raised a red flag, which is that, and particularly in the current context where we see continued farm evictions, particularly in the Western Cape, and growing peri-urban pressure on land and demands for land reform in an urban context in Gauteng and Cape Town, and yet there is no land being released in those areas. One of the things that, of course, this suggests is that the state is moving with where it happens to have land. And obviously, this is an approach that means that rather than going with where there is need and demand for land, it's rather being opportunistic. So let's just get a sense of how big is this amount. I thought it would be worth sharing an image of how much land have we been redistributing in South Africa. So remember that 94, the promise was 30% of the commercial farmland of South Africa would be redistributed in the first 5 years. 25 years later, we're sitting at about 10% of commercial farmland has been redistributed. We know some of it has been lost again from land reform through processes of reconcentration, particularly emerging commercial farmers getting into substantial debt and being repossessed both by private banks and even by the state-owned land bank. So in a sense, we don't have a very good handle on how much land, but we do know that it's been very volatile over time. This is the amount of land redistributed per year in South Africa since 1994. And you can see that it's very volatile. At its height, around 500,000 hectares. This is at the very end of the Mbeki presidency and down since then. And just for fun, I thought I'd give you some images of the presidencies. So we can see sort of very slow land reform in the 1990s, but picking up, and a hiatus, actually, importantly, when Thabo Mbeki came in and stopped the entire program and recrafted it as a program of transferring whole commercial farms from white commercial farmers to black commercial farmers, and really shifted the class agenda. And one of the important elements of this is that it's partly about class, but it's also about what kind of production system is being supported through land reform. One of the bizarre features of South Africa's land reform is that it does not involve subdivision of large agricultural holdings. quite at odds with the successful land reforms internationally, particularly Southeast Asia. So one of the features of South Africa's land reform is that it is a market-based approach mediated by the state, which typically reproduces the kinds of capital-intensive production with similar types of technologies and intensive production that we've seen in commercial farmlands. And we see really the very volatile, but nevertheless a very clear decline in land reform over the past 10 years, basically the Zuma presidency, alongside, of course, the rising political demand across the country for a more substantial land reform process. So this is the irony, of course. And so land reform under Ramaphosa has stagnated. It's sitting at under 100,000 hectares per year being redistributed. And bear in mind that with this shift towards a more elite focus, this declining amount of land per year is going to fewer and fewer people. So the significance of land reform in shifting production systems and in broadening access has both of those have been curtailed. One of the immediate questions we asked then about this new 700,000 hectares, it's 896 state farms, state-owned farming, registered farms, is where is this? So one of the things that is very striking is that the provinces where much of this land is located are the provinces that have former Bantustans or so-called homelands within them. This is the old map. And sorry, I'm in a slightly noisy area. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
My apologies. I'm just going to, if you give me 1 minute, I'm going to close the door. Right. Sorry about that. And one of the ideas that we had that would explain why the state has suddenly found this land is that what happened within the system of the native reserves being formalized into homelands and with the apartheid state's efforts to create these into consolidated territories is that there was a process of homeland consolidation where additional areas were acquired from white owners, particularly through the 60s and 70s, and then not actually formally incorporated into the homeland. So they still are registered as farms. And so that was our suspicion. So we went off and we got the database from the department, and we commissioned GIS mapping of the entire set of farms. And what we found, so if you can see, can you see my map now?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Yes.
So the little red blobs are all this land that is being made available. And what you can see is that there is a bit of a concentration here in parts of the Eastern Cape. There's almost nothing in KZN, except these tiny bits up towards the Eastern Cape and the Lesotho border. And there's quite a lot over around here in parts of the Northwest and into Limpopo. But our suspicions are confirmed when we overlay the former homelands. So what we can see here is that all the state land that the state is now proposing to redistribute is actually, these are areas that were bought for consolidation into the Bantustans. And in fact, what is clear is that these are already occupied. So this is land, when people hear that the state is releasing land, they think it's commercial farms, perhaps leased out to white commercial farmers. These are areas that are densely settled already. In many of these cases, there were leases entered into, often with Bantustan elites in the 1970s, but a lot of these areas have informal and customary forms of occupation. So we already know that several people have received eviction orders or have been told that if they wish to continue on this land, they will have to apply for it and pay rent to the state. So we see this as actually the extension of forms of state trusteeship into these areas, and likely going to be a bit of a flashpoint for conflict around land. So you can see here, if we look at Leboa up into Limpopo, all these properties are either inside or just around the very edges of the Bantustans, these small farms. So we think that on the one hand, it's very important to understand and to recognize the rights of people who occupy the land already, and that this not be framed as redistribution, but rather people should have their rights of tenancy confirmed in these areas. I think that ultimately, the important point here is that the state has been reducing the budget available for land reform. It's under political pressure to show that it's doing something about land. Elections are coming. We've had a high-level panel from Parliament in 2017. The debate around expropriation without compensation has not yielded concrete results. There's an expropriation bill still pending. If anything, the COVID moment has accentuated demand for land, particularly peri-urban demand for land, with large numbers of people, particularly backyard shack dwellers, are being evicted and moving into new areas on the outskirts of the towns and cities. So our sense is that if we were to go back to basics, what is land reform for and who should be benefiting from it? The key issues have already been identified through broad public processes that argue that firstly, redistribution has to take basic needs as a starting point. It shouldn't be equated only with rural and agricultural land. There needs to be an urban land reform. Secondly, the notion of equitable access to land suggests that people with the most urgent needs should be prioritized. Thirdly, the need for subdivision. Fourthly, the need to meet basic needs first. There was a recent study that we released, it was actually supported by National Treasury, and we released it earlier this year, which looked at employment-intensive forms of land reform. Contrary to the broad policy direction that we've seen to date, what we were proposing is that the types of land use and agricultural production that poor people specialize in and have a substantial advantage at, which is production of fresh produce and maintenance of livestock, particularly small livestock, are the priority areas. Instead, what we see is a lot of government planning, pushing people towards capital-intensive, large-scale production, essentially mimicking industrial agriculture, but without the kinds of financial backing that created that system. So I think that it's important that as people concerned with land justice and land reform, but also with an eye on what kind of food system do we produce out of it. There's certain important points, and the one is the importance of subdivision and the identification of well-located land with water, particularly close to cities, and giving people small holdings for food production, and linked to that, providing support for agroecological and alternatives that are not tying people into the same kinds of circuits of dependence on multinational corporations, on bought seeds, and so on. So I think that a key issue here is that the state cannot, by dishing out its own land, resolve the demand for land. It matters where land is. And so I think that while the numbers look great, it's important that we not be distracted by this release of state land. I want to mention also that I think that underlying a lot of the discussion around land acquisition, expropriation, compensation, lies a fundamental dispute about the kind of production system to be promoted. When I was in the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform, the debate around expropriation without compensation was not the most vociferous debate. In fact, the one section of the report that we could find no common ground on was on agrarian reform. What type of agrarian reform is to be promoted? The term just transition in agriculture, which I put into the report, repeatedly got removed. So actually, I think that while the headlines focus on questions of how the land is to be acquired, the substantial dispute underlying land reform is actually about agrarian change. and what types of production system and food system is to be supported in agriculture. And I think that it's an evolving debate among the land movements who are talking now about food sovereignty and about land sovereignty. And I think that what's quite important as a priority now for researchers and activists together is to start to document where alternatives are emerging, and where people are being able to produce their own food, connect into local markets. And the COVID crisis, in a sense, forces us to look at those opportunities. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for the opportunity just to share these broad thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was excellent. Comrades, comments, questions, engagements with Ruth. This is just wonderful insight into the big issues, the big debates we're having. So, anybody?
Maybe just a quick comment from
Here's
my
your
end.
chance. Yeah,
I mean,
go.
I just think it's riveting that you've actually put your finger on the problem of the 700,000 hectares that they suddenly produce. I mean, just really riveting research. So, my only comment.
So anybody else wants to add? Thank you for such great, Ruth. Okay, that's a one day, no question. No one day, any question?
Hello?
Ruth, I mean, in terms of the, sorry, yes, go ahead. Gabriel?
Yes, and thank you very much, Ruth, for that presentation. Maybe I just wanted to find out, is there an accompanying plan in terms of what the land is being acquired for? Because I think the land needs in South Africa are in two sections. One on the residential aspect and the other one on the agricultural aspect. Now, maybe the map that you have also shown, does it actually give to say how much of that would be allocated to residential and how much of it will also be allocated to agricultural? And even in the agricultural, it also has to be maybe demarcated by way of, is it livestock, is it maybe crop farming? And also, what are the support systems that are in place accompanying those plans to actually redistribute that land? Because at times it would be like just redistributing land for political reasons, if I would say, without that aspect of actually giving people a life or a livelihood in a place that they would be relocated to. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Can I also ask a question?
Okay, sure, Million.
Vishwas, I have to leave, but before I leave, I want to ask, because I'm moving house, so it's a lot of demands from me.
Not a problem.
Yeah.
Go.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for a fantastic presentation as usual. I'm going to ask an outsider question, so it can be very stupid, because I'm not a South African, and excuse me if I don't understand the political whatever. I remember some, I think 3-4 years ago, reading it's not an article, it's a story by Thabo Mbeki. And he said that a land was given to a South African settler. And he looked at the land, the settler, and he said that, wow, this land is not productive. So abandoned the land, he was doing some other things. So he said 2 Zimbabweans came, they looked at the land, and they've asked the landowner to allow them to farm it. And the land said, "No, it's not it's a useless land and whatever." And Zimbabwe said, insisted, and he gave it to them. And in short, the story that they made it very, very productive. He used this as an example to say that, land giving to farmers is not an easy thing. Probably the productivity would decrease, and that would impact, the food availability in the country. This is a narrative. It's based on that narrative. I do understand the other layer of what I'm asking, but I'm not saying, just asking it.
Thank you. Ruth, before you come in, I agree with you. I mean, the bigger debate is about agrarian transformation, production systems, and so on. But this expropriation bill is in the parliamentary process. And what is your take on it, and how do you see it being implemented, and what kind of impacts and policy function do you think it's going to play? Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks for that, and thanks for the provocation, Million. You've definitely provoked me. So you're right, there is a narrative, and the narrative that is particularly Thabo Mbeki promoted is, he said, people don't want land, they want jobs. Well, of course, what people want and what is available in a society is a different thing. Most people will tell you they want land and jobs. The point is that they have neither. And so I think that the question is, in a context where we have a very de-agrarianized society, we're 60% urbanized, and many people in rural areas are buying most of their food. They're buying food, they get social grants and buy industrially farmed and industrially manufactured processed foods. You know, so we have, you know, this contradiction of the kind of dualistic society and dualistic economy, which is that people are sitting on land without secure rights, without the kinds of means with which to derive a livelihood from that land. And at the same time, we have demand for land for a variety of purposes. So to my mind, the problem is not that people don't want land, they definitely want land. The question is whether there's a mismatch between what the state is offering and what people really want. So, you know, when some years ago we did a lot of action research with a small-scale farmer movement together with an NGO, and did a lot of action research walking around landscapes with evicted farm workers, talking about what kind of land needs they have. And what's very striking is this massive demand for well-located small holdings on which you can grow some food while also doing something else with your livelihood, while also being close to infrastructure, being able to send your kids to school and so on. So the model, the Thabo Mbeki model, is that you will have Mr. White commercial farmer and Mr. Black commercial farmer replicating the same types of production systems, the same kind of labor relations, the same kinds of technologies, but deracializing the industrial agricultural system. So I think that's the thing that needs to be ruptured. I think, Vishwas, so Million, just to say, I think that this narrative that South Africans, A, are lazy, B, don't want to farm, is one that is very much used as a justification for the status quo, while ignoring the many ways in which people are desperately wanting access to land. And even, I think that the COVID moment and the disruption of food systems, the disruption of supply chains has pushed this idea of needing to use land reform as part of relocalizing food systems. And that actually these lengthy value chains are partly what creates risk within the food system. But I wanted to say, coming to this expropriation issue, the expropriation bill that's now in Parliament, it's a version that's been revised repeatedly since 2008. Listen, it's a coherent piece of legislation. It's in line with the Constitution. It says the state can expropriate for land reform purposes. The expropriation, importantly, is an administrative process. It doesn't need to wait for the courts, and that's important. People can contest the level of compensation in the courts, and the compensation needn't be at market price, of course, in line with the Constitution. So we've had this contradiction of having, actually, I think in many ways, a progressive constitution, but extremely reactionary practices. The expropriation bill would bring us in line with the Constitution. But it is paradoxical that at the time that we're finally getting our expropriation legislation right, we're actually also revisiting the constitutional framework. And my view is that there are two scenarios. One is ultimately, after all these debates, the Constitution doesn't get changed. It's quite possible that that will happen because the ANC will need the EFF to vote together with it to change the Constitution. With it, it requires a 2/3 majority. And and the ANC can't do that alone. But the ANC will only promote a clarification, and it's up to the courts. If people want to contest their compensation, they can do so. So I think that the other scenario is one scenario is there's a minor clarification. The other scenario is that there's no change to the Constitution. So ultimately, the Constitution is not what's going to be important here. What's going to be important here is political impetus, and that's not going to be coming from the state. If anything, what we've seen this year is that as COVID hit, the food security budgets were slashed. So all of the budgets from the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development in the midst of a food crisis were reduced. So this also means that as the state now is dishing out what it considers its own land, we are going to see very limited financing available to people who will be allocated that land. And I think that, there's a broader question about whether we critique the way in which the state uses its power over land and state trusteeship. This is an issue across the continent that post-colonial governments have often continued the behavior of colonial states, which is to treat customary tenure and informal tenures of land as an absence of property and of asserted state control over that land, and used it as a mechanism both of political patronage and rent seeking, which is what's happening here, because there are people occupying those farms, and the state is now allocating those farms on a leasehold basis to new occupiers. So I think that this is going to be a flashpoint. I think that the politics around traditional authority is going to be an issue here. But I think that rather than focusing on this, I think far more important is the strategic importance of linking urban movements of people who are wanting access to land, the land occupation movements, the food sovereignty movements in the urban areas with the rural. And I think that that's the crucial strategic moment that we're at now. At a moment where it's patently obvious that the industrial food system cannot meet the urgent needs of our society.
Thank you, Ruth. That was excellent. And I think you've covered Gabriel, and you've covered Awande on traditional leaders as well. So we're going to transition. And again, big thank you to you and Million. This is recorded, so it's going to travel to activists on the ground and to movements.